and welcome to today's session on the crisis at the Capitol and the ongoing crisis in American democracy. My name is Graeme Boushey. I'm the director of the Jack Peltason Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of California, Irvine, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to this event sponsored by the UCI School of Social Science and co-sponsored with the UCI School Department of Political Science. Today's talk is convened as an emergency panel session on the ongoing crisis in American democracy that unfolded before us last Wednesday. On Wednesday, to read from a statement issued by the American Political Science Association, a nonpartisan association committed to the study of politics, government, and democracy in this country and beyond. The statement asserts yesterday or on Wednesday, a mob incited by the President of the United States overran the US Capitol in a violent insurrection. Those who forcibly entered the Capitol building and its offices struck at the heart of democratic principles in the United States, disrupting lawmaking and the peaceful transition of power that has served at the centerpiece of American democracy. By interrupting a largely ceremonial action on the false premise of overturning the results of a free and fair election, this mob led to the needless death and injury of Americans, imposed an imminent threat to US lawmakers, their staffs, and the staffs of the Capitol building. Calls immediately after this event have ranged from calling for the immediate removal of the President of the United States through the 25th Amendment, removal via impeachment, or efforts to maintain guardrails on the current administration as we wait for the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden. Wherever we go over the next few weeks, we know now that the hard work of rebuilding our institutions of democracy and the norms of democracy that bind us together as citizens of the United States start now, and they start now with dialogues like this one. Political scientists, sociologists who have spent their careers studying the role of institutions, norms, democratic deliberation, the historical antecedents and causes of political violence, and the path towards political stability. So today we are going to begin a conversation that begins with an effort to understand our crisis so that we can see our path towards resolving this ongoing crisis of democracy. We're going to be joined with 4 faculty experts who are global experts on different themes that are essential for us to understand the crisis that unfolded before us on Wednesday and has been unfolding for years, if not decades before. We are going to be joined first by Professor Marty Wattenberg, an expert in campaigns and elections and a long student of presidential politics in America, who will speak about the historical antecedents to this crisis and the things that might be done to institutionally bolster our democracy and protect it from such events in the future. We'll be followed by Professor Simone Chambers, an expert on democratic deliberation and political misinformation, who will talk about the role of misinformation in eroding democratic deliberation and impoverishing the public sphere and deliberations in democracy. We'll be followed by Professor Jeff Kopstein, expert on historical, ethnic, and political violence, especially in Eastern and Western Europe, and a student of the Soviet Union and historical perspectives on political violence. And finally, David Meyer, a sociologist and political scientist who's expert on social movements and who has recently, and somewhat amazingly, been studying both the protests unfolding over Black Lives Matter activism in the United States and also anti-mask, anti-vax, and increasingly anti-government protests that began to foment this summer. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn this forum over to Professor Marty Wattenberg, who's going to give us this background on the crisis in the American Capitol and our potential causes and our path forward.
Well, thanks, Graeme. It's good to see so many people here. And let me say quickly, I thought the most important thing I could do as somebody who teaches American politics full-time is to talk about the procedures that are available right now to remove the president and to talk about the difficulties of doing that in general and the difficulties of doing it so fast. So first you have the 25th Amendment, which has been talked about a lot over the last couple of days. And let me just quickly say, the 25th Amendment was not designed for a situation like this, to the best of my understanding. The 25th Amendment was written in the 1960s after the Kennedy assassination, and Putch and the other people in the Senate who were on that subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee brought in a whole bunch of historians to say, what are the problems with presidential succession and presidential disability? So one of the problems was there was no vice president after Kennedy was assassinated. The 25th Amendment deals with that. That's how Gerald Ford became president of the United States, through the 25th Amendment procedures. And one of the other things that historians talked about was disability. And what they were talking about was things like Garfield being shot, being disabled, being on morphine and pain, not being able to really act as president for months, Woodrow Wilson having a stroke and not being able to exercise his powers, and his wife hiding that from everyone. And that's what they designed it for, or Eisenhower's heart attack. Whereas Eisenhower and Nixon had an informal procedure, but they wanted to make it formal. So that when the president was seriously disabled after something like a serious heart attack, there would be a way for the vice president to assume powers. So the 25th Amendment, if it were to be invoked, would require Vice President Pence to initiate it, and with the support of the cabinet, all Trump loyalists. And the fact that 2 Trump cabinet members have just resigned, I think indicates that they felt that the votes weren't there, otherwise they would have stayed. So, and Pence himself has indicated, supposedly, he wants to have no role in this. And complicating this would be if you were to invoke the 25th Amendment, that Pence and a majority of the cabinet were to do that, then the president could challenge it. And then you'd have a few days of limbo, and you would have to have a 2/3 vote of both House and the Senate to remove Trump. And if he got even 1/3 of either house, and it looks like he's got the support of 1/3 of the House of Representatives based on the Republicans' vote after the insurrection, riot, you want to call it, I just don't see it happening. And it's not a viable option. Okay, second option is impeachment and removal. Let's be really clear. Impeachment is just an indictment. Donald Trump was impeached before. He became the 3rd president to be officially impeached. Nixon was not impeached. He was on the verge of being impeached. They requires just a simple majority, but let's remember the Democrats have very narrow margins in the House right now. So in order to pass it, they will have to have almost complete unity, and or they would have to get some Republican votes. And so far, there's just a scattering of Republican votes for impeachment. So last I heard, they were pursuing impeachment. There's a lot of support for that in the Democratic caucus, and it might be possible. And it might be possible to bring the impeachment to the floor before January 20th. I think it's probably not likely that they could do it within a day unless they have 2/3 support so they can suspend the rules to get it immediately done. Now, in the days of Nixon, after the smoking gun tape came out, the House was talking about a 1-day impeachment proceeding because there was such overwhelming support. The vote on the impeachment report was 412 to 3. We don't have anything like that at the moment. It's not to say that we won't, but at the moment we don't. So it's possible, after a week, you could have Trump impeached, a few days left in his term. What would be the benefits of that? Well, the Senate has to have a trial immediately. And so they would come into session to debate that. Probably it becomes a bit of a moot point by January 20th if things go on. A couple advantages that they would have doing this is that they could compel testimony on the Senate floor and ask people who were involved with Trump and going to Trump for advice on what to do, begging him to do things supposedly, that they would be called to testify publicly. And a real potential advantage, which might be attractive to some Republicans later on, is one of the little known things about the removal option is that they could also disqualify Trump from any future office in the United States from now on. And so that would rule out Trump 2024. It would also rule him out as running for the Senate or whatever. And I just don't see that they would have a vote before January 20th, but they could potentially have a vote after January 20th. And that would be really interesting. The disadvantage of that obviously would be in the Nixon era, people would get Nixon over. Do we want to keep stretching things out? That will be one of the things that might be talked about if we continue in this vein. But as for Trump leaving office before January 20th, I think that is a real long shot at this point. If people have some specific questions that I can answer in the chat, go ahead and post them in the chat and I'll be monitoring that. And if I can answer it really quickly, I'll do so. So let me turn the floor to Graeme. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marty. And I failed to mention that if you have questions that come to you, you can post them in the question and answer area down at the bottom of your Zoom on the toolbar, and that these questions will then be read by me and my co-moderator, Louis DeCipio, chair of the Department of Political Science here at UCI. We'll move next to Professor Simone Chambers. Simone, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in the panel. So we have this very strange situation. The United States is generally thought to have free and fair elections by all sort of objective measures. There's very little fraud, and there's really no systematic fraud in the elections. But we have a situation where we have millions of people who believe that the 2020 election was stolen and that there was quite extensive fraud, particularly in swing states and close states. So what I want to talk about today is the role of social media in sort of creating this situation, in facilitating these falsehoods and misinformation on the part of the public, and what role it played on Wednesday. So if we look at the role of the social media and the internet in general in the events on Wednesday, I see kind of three main roles, two of which I'm really not going to talk about. So the first and easiest to deal with is just mobilization. The internet, social media is just an amazing tool of mobilization, but we all get to use it. Black Lives Matter, get out the vote. I mean, everybody gets to use it. So that obviously played a big part in just getting people there. The second is the dark web, where Nazis and white supremacists and QAnon and a lot of really dangerous people, where they lurk, where they recruit, where they plan, and where they organize. And that obviously also played a large role, particularly in what I like to call the kind of the front end commandos of the events on Wednesday. We think that people say that there were 44,000 people there on Wednesday, and they don't really know how many people participated in the assault on the Capitol, but surely not 44,000, a very small minority. And most of the people who were there not because they were part of QAnon or even these organizations, but because they really believed that the election was stolen and that they are, huge fans of Trump. So I'm interested in the third role of the internet, and that's what can be called the open internet, where ordinary citizens get their information, their opinions are formed. And in this case, the millions of people really believe, it appears, that the election was stolen and fraudulent. So the question is, how did that happen? And one of the things I find really interesting in thinking about it is to compare it to 2016. So in 2016, there was a lot of misinformation and there was a lot of disinformation, but it was quite different in 2016. Although people sometimes talk about the disinformation campaign, there wasn't really a central campaign. It was very decentered. It really involved a lot of kind of confusion and then the lack of trust in information. It preyed on people's ignorance and actually lack of education about how the internet worked. And it was driven by algorithms, that is, algorithms that upranked certain types of information, particularly false information or sensational information. It was also driven by bots that magnified certain kinds of information. So there was a lot of disinformation. It's not clear if it affected the outcome of the election, but you can't really say that it was a concerted, centralized campaign. Fast forward to 2020, situation is very different. There's one narrative, it's very centered, it's very focused, and it begins with the questioning of mail-in ballots, and it comes from one source, and that is the source of Trump and Trump's campaign. There was a huge, huge study done at Harvard that came out in October, humongous study that said the three main purveyors of misinformation about the election, about voting, were Trump himself, of course, via Twitter, Trump's campaign, and Fox News, which is a mainstream mass media outlet. And the study showed that actually social media and algorithms and bots and so on really played a secondary role. So what you see in 2020 is really a much more kind of traditional story of propaganda, but propaganda that has kind of been juiced up through Twitter. And there are really four factors that come together almost kind of accidentally in this misinformation campaign. The first, of course, is the pandemic, which shows very early on that there's going to be different rules for election and that there's going to be a large role for mail-in ballot. The second feature is Trump and Trump's campaign that early on recognizes that there's a kind of vulnerability here because voting, mail-in ballots will be predominantly Democrats for reasons having to do with like pandemic and other things. So there's an early strategy to target and undermine the legitimacy of mail-in ballots. And then this expands, particularly after Election Day, to other sorts of possible shenanigans having to do with elections. So these two factors then join two other factors, and these are the platforms. So Trump has two platforms. The first platform, which is the most powerful platform, is the presidency. And that is connected then to Twitter. And so these two hugely powerful platforms are connected to a very targeted, very centralized, very concerted, focused effort at misinformation on a very particular issue. They come together and it's a huge, powerful propaganda machine, which just takes a lot of people, a lot of supporters of Trump into its fold, if you will. As I say, a very different story from 2016. So what do you do about that? The first and most obvious thing you do about it is that you deplatform. And in the case of Trump, you unelect him and you kick him off Twitter. But that, of course, is not like a systemic solution or a long-term solution. I mean, it might be a solution for stopping Trump having some next plan of misinformation. But I think we have to look deeper at this process of deplatforming. And also, I want to ask the question of whether, in this case, that the misinformation about election fraud, whether in any case it's too late. So let's look at deplatforming. So between 2016 and 2020, there really has been a huge shift in social media. That is, after 2016 and the revelations of all the kind of stuff that went on, there has been a really kind of concerted scrambling on the part of Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on all these platforms to show that they're actually good citizens, that they actually can fact check, that they can tag things as false, that they can deplatform if they have to, and so on. And this drive or push to self-regulation has been driven by four factors. The first factor is, of course, the fear of real regulation. So they don't want to be regulated, so they want to show that they are actually good citizens that can regulate themselves. So this is pushing for a certain type of behavior. The second is the kind of public shaming of users. So some people think that, Facebook is too big to fail. But in actual fact, it's not. These things can pop up, and especially if some of these antitrust pushes go, then Facebook will be faced with competition, and their users have actually not been very happy with the way in which they've been dealing with questions of misinformation. 3, and I really wouldn't discount this, and that's the internal pressure of employees. That is, these corporations have different kinds of internal structures and different types of employees, and they have employees that really believe slogans like "do no evil," and there has been a lot of internal push to try to self-regulate. And then the third is, of course, advertisers who don't want to be giving their money to platforms that support white supremacists. And these 4 pressures have really created, relative to 2016, a lot of self-regulation on the part of these platforms to try to control particularly misinformation. But the question we have to ask is whether this is adequate and whether this is something that we can depend upon. And I think Wednesday really showed that we can't. So one of the things that I found so mind-blowing on Wednesday was the 4 p.m. decision by Twitter, basically by this one guy, Jack Dorsey, to deplatform Trump and to close his Twitter account. Some people are saying this decision was as important as bringing out the National Guard, because some people say, look, he could have rallied the troops, and it's unlikely that there could have been another assault on the Capitol, but he could have got them out in the streets, on the barricades. There could have been all sorts of more blood shed. And it was this one guy who just happened to have the right, maybe, instincts who shut him down. This is not a feasible and it's not a viable way to regulate these platforms. And I predict, and I don't really have time, anyway, I predict that there is going to be a massive amount of regulation coming down the pipe. In some sense, we've only been dealing with this for 4 years. The internet has been around for a long time and people have been worried about it, but the kind of universal consensus on the disastrous results of having so much misinformation has really been only around for 4 years, since 2016. And there is a consensus about that we have to do something about it. There is no consensus about what is to be done, but there is a consensus that something has to be done. And that consensus, it's not about silencing incivility. It's not even about worrying about the dark web. It's worrying about the basic circulation of information necessary for democracy that's being undermined. And this is being driven by the analysis of 2016 and 2020, but it's also being driven by the disinformation having to do with COVID, which is killing people, which is resulting in deaths. And so I predict that in the next 4 years, there's going to be, or actually maybe a little bit of a longer, the regulative atmosphere regarding social media is going to look very, very different. Final question. In this particular case of what happened on Wednesday, is it actually too late? In some sense, it is too late. And here we have to bring in another actor, and that is the 147 members of Congress who voted, who did not support the certification of the election. What these groups did is that they have continued this narrative of fraud. And they've continued this thing, where there's smoke, there's fire. Would these people really have voted against it? If there wasn't something, we should really investigate, And so this keeps that narrative going, and that has 2 consequences, I think. The first consequence is that it is cover for these very dangerous groups. When I look at those 44,000 people who were on the mall on Wednesday, I think of, say, the 2,000 up front who really had no interest in democracy, and 42,000 who were cover for those 2,000. They thought that they were actually supporting democracy, that they were supporting, and fighting against electoral fraud, whereas this 2,000 really have only interest in undermining democracy. And the longer this narrative continues, and it's supported by people like the Congress people who, the longer that will be a kind of cover to ordinary citizens say, well, I don't like the actions, but of course, they were feeling strongly about the cause. And that'll just make it really difficult to be able to prosecute these people, to be able to really move forward on clamping down on what happened. And then the second thing, the consequence, I think the first is an unintended consequence of these 147 people, but the second is an intended consequence, and that is to maintain the narrative of fraud in the public sphere in order to justify extensive reform movements of electoral processes across the country at the state level. There will be attempts to make it harder to vote across the board, and those attempts will all be focused on making it harder to vote for people of color, people, young people, people, lower income people, people who basically do not vote Republican. And that will be floated and justified by the narrative of a fraudulent election. Thank you. Those are mine. Sorry, I went over a little bit.
Thank you, Simone. That was fascinating. We'll move now to Professor Jeffrey Kopstein, Department of Political Science.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. It's a great honor. My remarks will be those of a student of political violence. So I'm going to restrict myself to really trying to understand the storming of Congress itself, these events. And there's a great deal we still don't know about them. And I'm really going to try to view them through three lenses, if you will. The first is the lens of a coup. The second is the lens of a revolution. And the third is the lens of a riot. And I think all three lenses have pluses and minuses, and I think they can help us understand what's going on. So was it a coup or a self-coup? There's a lot of people who say it is, so let's pull back for 1 minute. Students of world politics generally mean by this a seizure of power involving the military. On the one hand, the evidence is strong that Trump has attempted to involve the top brass of the military in politics. He's attempted to do this for some time. I'm not going to summarize all the evidence here, but the main pieces are really the following. The high-level replacements at the Pentagon after the election, including the firing of the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, the firing of several lower-level department officials and their replacement with Trump loyalists, several statements by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, since June 2020, indicating the determination of the top brass not to be involved in the election. And finally, last but certainly not least, the stern letter from 10 former secretaries of defense last Sunday, reiterating that the election was over and all that remained to do was to really just count the electoral votes. Now, why, I ask myself, would General Milley have felt constrained to stress the loyalty of the armed forces to the Constitution? Why would 10 former secretaries of defense would note any of this if they weren't concerned, if they'd not gotten wind of a plan by Trump to use the military to retain power? I ask that question of myself. I'm not stating it as a fact. Of course, as a student of politics of other places in the world, you'll normally not want to ask not only about the generals, but you'd also want to know, and as far as we know, the colonels, the majors, the captains, the lieutenants were also uninterested in staging a coup. If this was a coup, if what happened the other day wasn't a coup, it looks much more like a putsch, a term commonly referred to as a much less organized militarized seizure of power. The first and most famous of these was, of course, the beer hall putsch in 1923 in Munich, when Hitler and a ragtag group of soldiers, but mostly ex-soldiers, attempted to seize power. It failed. Hitler was arrested and he was imprisoned, where, of course, you know, he wrote Mein Kampf. The beer hall putsch failed, which is why some commentators have termed this one the other day the beer belly putsch, not the beer hall putsch, but the beer belly putsch. But a poorly organized and executed military coup, a failed coup, is still nonetheless a coup. And there's a couple of things we know about coups. Most are poorly organized, so don't think this poor organization is in any way unusual. Most fail. And those that do succeed usually succeed against the expectations of virtually everyone. It's important to recall that nobody took Mussolini seriously in 1922 with his March on Rome. He was universally seen as a clown and with his ridiculous posing and theatrical self-presentation. Even fewer took the Austrian Corporal Adolf Hitler seriously with his toothbrush mustache and ill-fitting suits and speaking style that violated the norms of polite bourgeois sensibility. Perhaps even less seriously than American voters took a ridiculously made up and coiffed reality TV host. All of this, the ridiculousness of it all, made up, in other words, does not disqualify this as a coup, does not say that it was not a seditious conspiracy aimed at the illegal seizure of power involving elements of the military. I would only point you yesterday to Trump's own former Russia hand, the otherwise very sober Fiona Hill, who declared this to have been a coup. And there were many other questions that I want to see answered before I dismiss this characterization out of hand. For if the generals were uninterested, we still do not know if the Department of Defense used its authority to prevent adequate preparedness on Capitol Hill. In other words, we do not know the extent to which it was organized and coordinated within the administration. That undoubtedly will become the object of many political science, sociology, and history dissertations in the years to come. But let's put this aside for a second and focus on the day itself. And when we do that, the picture that emerges is much different. Let us try, as hard as it may be, and Simone tried this, to spend a minute on the views of this ragtag group that stormed the Congress, or at least were around the Congress. For them, this felt like a revolution. It felt more real than their normal, boring daily lives. Now, I was in Berlin when the Berlin Wall fell, and I spent time at the headquarters of the secret police, the Stasi, when it was stormed by demonstrators who had overwhelmed armed security staff. Paper was flying everywhere. People were running around the halls. Lots of disorder. That's what a revolution feels like. And the people storming the Congress believed they were involved in an act of liberation. The lens of revolution, as opposed to a coup, refocuses our attention away from the violent means and on to the ends, the intentions and the hopes of those involved. Now, what did they want? To the extent we can discern this, they wanted regime change or regime restoration. They viewed themselves as revolutionaries or counter-revolutionaries. The discourse of taking back the country reflected a sense of having been expropriated, a sense of having been denied ownership. They wanted to reverse the vote. Now, how might this have come about? Now, here again, we know far too little. On the one hand, it's pretty difficult to believe that the guy wearing the fur Viking hat, one Jake Angelini, also known as the QAnon shaman, had any idea what he was up to. But there's more disturbing pictures of well-equipped young men and women with who seem to be prepared for a hostage situation, including the possession of small arms and zip cuffs. It was a large and amorphous group of rioters who entered Congress on Wednesday, and we need to know much more about their intentions. It's quite possible that many, if not most, were just there to make a statement and had no real intention of overthrowing the government or actually stopping the Electoral College altogether. We do know that elements of very similar looking group that stormed the Congress in Michigan several times over the past year were ultimately arrested by the FBI and discovered to have a plot to behead the governor of Michigan. Now, I just called them rioters, you may have noticed. I dropped the word coup. I also dropped the word revolutionaries, and I didn't even use the word insurrectionaries. If the conceptual frame of the coup focuses our attention on the means, and the conceptual frame of revolution focuses our means on the ends or the goals, the conceptual frame of the riot focuses on other elements, and these are equally important. If you watch the videos or listen to the participants, something else emerges than that of a coup or a revolution. The disorder, the yelling, the howling, the exuberant joy, the defiling of the physical structure, the looting of offices, the bearing of Confederate and other seditious symbols, the tearing off of the name shields of the offices, the urinating on the walls, the snapping of selfies. As one journalist put it, for all the violence in the air, the mood was less coup and more that of a college football tailgate. But this was in many ways a festival of violence. And if the sheer goofiness of it all, epitomized by the Viking guy, does indicate a tailgate party, let us not forget that it was violent. In fact, this strange mixture of celebration, of joy, of almost giddiness, and gruesome violence, it's pretty common. This notion of a festival of violence, and I've used that term several times. In fact, it's taken from probably the most extensive study of lynching in the American South. Lynchings were public spectacles, were accompanied by much joking, by joyous yelling. In my own work on anti-Jewish pogroms in the first weeks of World War II, the violence perpetrated by neighbor against neighbor, by local militias, was accompanied by music, singing, and even church bells. The atmosphere of the rioters was was largely happy. They were having fun. Of course, in any festival of violence, there are not only perpetrators, but also terrified victims. Anyone who's ever been under attack knows the fear the representatives felt on that day. Let us not forget that these happy rioters in Congress also erected gallows. Many wore Confederate or other symbols of racist sedition. Let us not forget that they were armed and prepared to kill those who would not get out of their way. They did. And that within the Senate and House chambers are elected officials prepared to fight for their lives. They put on gas masks and ultimately were whisked away to secure locations somewhere in the Capitol where they could be guarded so that they were not killed. Of course, we tend to see events through the things that interest us. And so I watched these events over and over again. I couldn't help thinking that whatever else this was also a pogrom, a festival of violence. Many of the perpetrators who go free themselves will remember it that way. Many rioters may have entered the building with uncertain intentions, having been swept up in the moment, the fun of it all, especially once they realized their own lives were not at risk, that their targets would not harm them, and that the police were not ready to use live ammunition to prevent entry. These kinds of events can get out of control very quickly as rioters become lynchers, as revolutionaries become pogromists. Some may realize they've gone too far and recapture their sense of morality and humanity, or others grab a souvenir, and still others succumb to the intoxication of power and plop their rear end down in the chair of the Speaker of the House. And others, if they find they have a chance, may choose to behead the Vice President of the United States. And so, as we think about what this was, a protest, a coup, a counter-revolution, a riot, a pogrom, a failed lynching, it was really all of these things, each with its own role to play. Let me conclude by saying that the main reason we are not able to categorize January 6th in Congress is that it's not yet over. As a student of political violence, all my instincts tell me that we're still in an exceptionally precarious situation. The ringleader is still at large. He has his main means of communication with the American people restored. And the many thousands of people willing to use violence for political ends have not stood down. They have merely been told to stand back and stand by.
Thank you, Professor Kopstein. We move to Professor David Meyer, who's been studying this movement for quite some time.
Thank you, Graeme. I put together some pictures because it helps me think through stuff, and it was such a theatrical and visually interesting set of events that we're still trying to figure out. I write about social movements. I really like what I write about. The downside is stuff happens and I don't immediately know answers. And I'm always, I'm always wondering what's new, what's not, what information that I already have can I use? The attack on the Capitol was dramatic. It certainly scared the hell out of members of Congress who had to experience it, who were whisked away, in Jeff's words, and protesters inside and outside the Capitol. I show you that picture of the Confederate flag because it points out stuff about American history that's kind of interesting and puts what's happened in the last couple of days in a perspective. If you look at the top of that flag, of the battle flag of the Confederacy, you will see a portrait of John C. Calhoun. Calhoun was the chief theorist of secession, states' rights, and a unvarnished advocate for preserving slavery. If you look straight ahead to the demonstrators' nose and look up, that's a picture of Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was a radical Republican and a strong anti-slavery activist. In 1856, he, a senator, was beaten on the floor of the Senate. almost lost his life. So disruption, violence, danger in the Capitol is not new, okay? And it's deep in our history. What's new? So the kind of ideal type of democracy is we lost at the polls, better luck next time. Well, in America, lots of times we lose at the polls and then we take to the streets. After Donald Trump won the Electoral College in 2016, there were demonstrations across the nation and in Washington, D.C. On the day he took the inaugural oath, Disrupt J20 ran havoc in parts of the streets of Washington, D.C. Okay, there were broken windows, there was a limousine vandalized, over 200 arrests, and lots of confrontations with the cops. Okay. The next day, 500,000 people marched non-violently in Washington, D.C. I say march, but that's not really accurate because it was too crowded. People couldn't really move. They just kind of stood around and bumped up against each other. And the image of the Women's March has kind of obscured the Disrupt J20 demonstrations because the Women's March was much bigger and much more sustained. There is violence in America. There is dissatisfaction that spills out into the streets over electoral outcomes. What about protest at Capitol buildings? Something new? Well, that's from earlier this year in East Lansing, Michigan, where people who were unhappy about strictures on public gatherings gathered in public with arms, which were legal, and tried to storm the legislature, which is not legal. Okay? Those are teachers in Kentucky, Mitch McConnell's state, in 2018, seizing the Capitol while demonstrating in the Capitol, in Frankfurt for better salaries. Not new. That's 2011, Madison, Wisconsin. In Madison, Wisconsin, in protest of a bill that Scott Walker was pushing that limited collective bargaining severely, people filled the Capitol, filled the streets, and protested for weeks. And that's really dramatic. That's February in Madison, Wisconsin. It is cold. Okay? What is different is this is the only time that I could find where the President of the United States urged a crowd to attack his enemies directly, to intimidate people who were opposed, people who would certify the election and allow Joe Biden to take office. That's new. Okay? That's hours before the seizure of the Capitol. Trump gave a speech to these very same people saying, we need strength, weakness doesn't work, we need to be strength. They can't stand up to 25,000 of my people out there. I'm marching with you. He went back into the White House, they kept marching. Okay? What is also weird and interesting is this time the enemies weren't those socialists and Democrats. They were Mike Pence, his vice president, and Mitch McConnell, Senate majority leader. No, I'm sorry, minority leader. Okay? That's new. Okay? Protest polarizes. Protest pushes people to take sides. Okay? And there's plenty of protest in the Trump era and plenty of polarization. This time, however, it seems like the breaking point has moved significantly to the right. The events in the Capitol seem to have made lots of Republicans reconsider their positions. It's a split in the GOP coalition, desperate resignations to spend the last 2 weeks cleaning whatever dignity you have left so that you can get a job afterward. Okay? And people made different decisions about which way to go. That's Josh Hawley, who stood with the challenges. He originally had a dozen senators who were going to stand with him, but only about half that many stayed. That's Kelly Loeffler, the senator from Georgia for another few moments, who decided that she was no longer going to support the challenge to the electoral votes from other states. And because she lost her reelection bid, she came into our slideshow to wave goodbye to you. Scaramucci is a unit of time of about 10 days. We're only about one Scaramucci away from the end of the presidency. And already, anyway, people are talking about extraordinary means with this amount of time to get rid of President Trump. People in the streets invoke the 25th Amendment, impeach Trump again. Marty talked about all that very well. What's interesting is it's not just people in the streets or Democrats, but it's a few Republicans. And there's a division in the Republican Party about that. Jim Jordan from Ohio, who just got the Presidential Medal of Freedom, doesn't support it. Adam Kinzinger from Illinois, another Republican, has said he would support an impeachment. Okay? What's next? Institutional responses, reforms, recriminations, and prosecutions, all likely to be discussed and take place. There's every reason to believe that the government will pursue at least some of the visible protesters in the Capitol. But white nationalism isn't going to disappear. It has a long history that goes back way before Donald Trump and is likely to continue afterward. It made an appearance in the Capitol on Wednesday, but it's going to continue outside the Capitol. That's also from the demonstrations on Wednesday. Okay. Is there a movement that's bigger than Donald Trump? Well, Jeff was right in talking about the collection of people outside and inside the Capitol as an amorphous coalition, people with all kinds of different interests. There was certainly a belief, as Simone said, that Democrats cheated to win the election. There were fundamentalist Christians. I wanted to give you this picture, and I was looking for one of Cruz, Cotton, and Hawley, but I couldn't find one without Marco Rubio in it. So I'm not going to talk about Marco Rubio. He's the second face. Cruz, first, Cotton, third, and Hawley are all trying to capture the Trump coalition to serve their own ambitions. They are all far smarter and far more disciplined than Donald Trump is, and they are people to watch in the coming era. What's particularly interesting is that Cruz on the left of the picture and Hawley on the right made a decision to support the challenge to the electors. And Cotton, number 3 over there, said, no, that's not the right thing to do. I assume all of these well-educated strategic actors were calculating their own fortunes based on the positions they take. It's not clear which of them is right. Okay? And there were people who were following odd conspiracy theories. If you look at a big picture of demonstration and just start looking at the signs, you'll see all kinds of crazy things. A slightly bigger frame picture, you'll find an Israeli flag. You'll find a Confederate flag. You'll find signs and protests about all kinds of things. It is not presently a coherent whole. If you listen to the interviews that people are doing, you will become less impressed with the coherence and the cogency of the arguments. But that's not a way to make judgments. Every reporter knows if you start interviewing people at a demonstration and let them talk, you'll find somebody who will say the wackiest stuff in the world. So was it a revolution? Horn helmet guy. That guy has said that's to make Mike Pence pay for deserting Trump. Okay? Trump himself is not necessarily coherent most of the time. So to find a strict ideology or a set of claims is difficult. They certainly were upset about the election. It's not clear what else is there. Some people said it's the $2,000. We want our $2,000. The question about the future is the degree to which these diverse strands of activists can be united or whether they maintain a fragmented, idiosyncratic, marginal existence. It's really important to understand that none of this stuff is new. That's the Michigan militia from 2008. That is the occupation of the Malheur Reserve in Oregon, in which armed men seized federal property to make it available to the people. Okay. That is the Minuteman Project to stop illegal immigration, which goes back to 2004. The anti-abortion movement, which goes back to 1973, at least demonstrating in Washington, D.C. And God, who are those people? Oh, The point is there are lots of divergent activist constituencies who were represented in the Trump coalition who don't necessarily like each other or plan to work with each other. The bizarre thing, right before we came on today, there was video of Lindsey Graham being called a traitor when he got home to South Carolina, people marshaling to attack Senator Graham. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of Lindsey Graham. I'd go out to a protest about Lindsey Graham most days, but I would not go out to protest that he thought it was important to certify the electoral votes. What happens next is a function of who's involved in investing, organizing, and coordinating diverse constituencies in a coherent project. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and to all of our panelists and to our audience for submitting amazing questions during this discussion. Please feel free to add them. I'm going to turn the first question over to my co-moderator, Chair of Political Science, Professor Louis DeCipio. And we will be taking turns asking our questions and looking at the questions you submit. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Graeme, and thank you and the Center for organizing this so quickly. Let me also extend my thanks to the staff of the Department of Political Science, Claudia Chefs, Ekua Arin, who really pulled this together on a moment's notice and dropped everything to do it. So my thanks to you, and also to the School of Social Sciences for their assistance. Please take a moment to look at the Q&A session. It's impressive, the conversations that are going on there while we're speaking. I guess as a teacher, I sometimes am concerned about multitasking, but here I think it's working very productively. Let me begin with sort of a theme that David raised towards the end of his presentation and ask our panelists to look forward a little bit. Tapping our historical knowledge here, particularly Jeff and Marty, what does the research say about the importance and drawbacks of prosecution and punishment for the insurrectionists and potentially for President Trump as well? And then also looking to the future, again, tapping some historical examples where appropriate, what are some reforms that Congress can enact to avoid situations like this going forward? So let me start with the first question, and maybe look to Jeff and Marty for that.
Marty, you want to go? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, it's a tough set of questions, and I wasn't completely expecting it, so I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants a bit. After World War II, there were really two sets. The general question is, what do you do after an authoritarian episode? Right? That's what comparative politics would look at. And after World War II, the Germans decided that they were going to institute something called militant democracy. And that is that we're a democracy, we believe in democracy, but the one thing we will not allow is to have the enemies of democracy use the institutions and tools and freedoms of democracy in order to destroy it. Now, what they do, so in Germany, you can't publish a book by Hitler. You just can't do it. It's not allowed. It's illegal. If you're a party and you organize and you say we're a Nazi party, they'll first investigate you, then ban you, and if you keep on organizing, they'll throw you in jail. And that is universally supported in Germany. Now, we're probably not ready to head that far, nor what we just experienced was really the Nazis, clearly. In Eastern Europe, after communism, they also attempted to conduct a kind of investigation. And that's, I think, we're probably where we're heading. We're heading towards some sort of congressional investigation of what occurred, and it clearly needs to be done. I don't hesitate to stand for it.
We may have lost Jeff temporarily.
Is everybody frozen?
You were briefly.
Okay. So the Justice Department may also do their own investigation. for legal consequences. I think the best way forward is consequences have to be drawn, both legal and political. Without that, it's going to keep on coming back, right? I think Simone put her finger on the most important thing, though, and that's the question of deplatforming. For the one day that that guy was deplatformed, I dare you to tell me that everybody didn't feel a lot better, that he could not communicate with his army on that day. That's arguably, and I think Simone's right on the money, that's arguably what might have saved the Republic. And we don't really realize the situation we were in yet. I don't think we realize how precarious it was and is. He's been allowed back on, but he's behaving himself. And I think that's obviously the deal for now. We'll see. We'll see.
Marty?
Okay. Well, on Twitter, I'd say, he did release a statement via Dan Scavanino. And I mean, the difference would be that you didn't have as widespread a distribution, but I mean, the president can get any information out. All he has to do is go to the press room and in the White House and put stuff out. So I'm not so sure that the social media is that big of an effect right now. Anyway, getting into the history, I just quickly talk about Ford's pardon of Nixon, which, a month after Nixon had resigned, it was very unpopular. It was opposed by 65% of the American public. And arguably it was a crucial factor in his defeat in 1976. People still opposed it at that point. But years later, public opinion changed on that. I've seen very clear evidence of that. And I can tell you, when Bill Clinton gave former President Ford the Presidential Medal of Freedom, he said that he ran his first race in 1974 against Nixon and the Ford pardon specifically, and ranted about how terrible the pardon of Nixon was. And he said, looking back, he looked right at President Ford and said, you did the right thing. You did the right thing for the country. We got past it and you were right. So looking back on it, how we see things now might not necessarily be the right thing. I still think that having a Senate trial could be beneficial in terms of getting the information out very early in the Biden administration, but there's also a risk that this is a continuing distraction, and we have other things to worry about in this country, and they'll be up to the politicians to make their decisions on that. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you. And then as to the question of reforms going forward, we've certainly heard of something about regulation of social media, but beyond what sort of legislative reforms, because certainly in the era after Watergate, Congress passed a number of limits on presidential power.
Right. Presidential power being so unchecked is, a regular fear. And, we're again in the situation that we were in Nixon's last days, where the word is going out, as I understand it, to the defense chiefs: don't do anything unless you're sure that this is, there's good reason for these orders. And, Congress should be looking into that. I mean, that's the most troubling thing right now, and clarifying the chain of command here and what constitutes a legal order and a not a legal order. So I imagine they might do something like that. And I also imagine that there'll be a full review of security. One of the things that I have not seen mentioned at all was that right across the street from the Capitol is the US Supreme Court. You had this mob of people that obviously had a lot of bad elements in it. And the security at the court is a fraction of the security in the Capitol. And imagine if the Supreme Court justices had been there and they had stormed the Supreme Court. And I think they have to review the whole area around the Capitol and the Supreme Court. And when I say the Capitol, I also mean the office buildings. And there could be some big changes coming. I'm also concerned about the inauguration, whether they should have the inaugural on the west side of the Capitol, which is where you saw the scaffolding the other day. And I think the east side would be much more secure. And even more than that, I think they could go indoors as they did in the 1985 Reagan inauguration because of the cold. And it's something that they should be considering over the next few days. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Graeme?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I really love this discussion. Thanks for all your perspectives. I join many of the people in the comments with having questions about the benefits and drawbacks of prosecution and punishment, and maybe institutional sanction for the members of the riot who took over the Capitol and the elites who encouraged them. So for all of you, from your perspectives, how do you view and what does research say about the importance of prosecution and punishment for those who encouraged or participated in this insurrection? Are there lessons from historical antecedents or contemporary politics that would lead us to watch for certain things moving forward? Or Simone, does formal public sanction and punishment do things to the ability of misinformation to continue to proliferate in different spheres? David, how are these types of actions viewed in the social movements that sustain these actors? So for all of you, I'm interested in how we should evaluate those calls from some to vigorously and aggressively prosecute and punish those who participated in this. And I guess also to ask you how you viewed those moments we watched on TV as people simply meandered out of the Capitol after the events of Wednesday, apparently allowed to go back to the streets by the Capitol Police.
I can start with a couple of things. The policing story isn't all known yet. The policing story is really important, and it's really DC policing in DC is particularly fragmented because there are different bodies responsible for different things, and the coordination is sometimes a heavy lift. This may give impetus to like pushing the DC as a state, so the control is that there's more accountability. That's the policing story. In terms of prosecution, somebody who busts a window, somebody who vandalizes a limousine, somebody who hits another person, those are acts of violence which are prosecutable, which are not constitutionally protected, nor should they be. And I think it's entirely appropriate for the Justice Department to go after some of those people. And I think it will be a large deterrent to others of them. I'm less enthusiastic about incitement to riot. Historically, incitement to riot has been a political charge, which has been used against unpopular groups. And I absolutely see the logic of being angry about Donald Trump encouraging his followers to intimidate Congress. That's something to be really angry about it. Proving the crime of incitement, absent political bias, however, is pretty difficult. And I would rather focus what's going to consume massive resources on the commission of violent crimes. Oh, you want the other thing about incitement is there's a movie about the trial of the Chicago 8/7 on Netflix, and those guys were charged with incitement to riot too. You know, it's a political charge, and I don't like to use the courts to enforce political opinions.
Thank you. Do others of you have reactions?
So, I mean, from my point of view, the issue is what kind of public opinion support there will be for those kinds of actions. And, you know, so protest and marching, and this is part of democracy. What really upsets me about this particular one, I mean, of course, there's the assault, but that so many people were there on complete fabricated narrative, right? That there was no steal, there was no fraud. And And they will believe that, you know, a lot of the prosecution is politically motivated, even, you know, justified prosecution. So, and I'm not sure, you know, in the short run, how you undo the damage that has been done by this particular strand of misinformation, particularly when there are people in Washington, powerful people who are continuing this false narrative, even without Trump's, you know, ranting. And I think if this narrative of, if it still stays afloat, then every single prosecution is going to be contested. It's not going to change. It's going to be considered to be illegitimate, and it's going to, you know, continue in the future.
Professor DeCipio?
Thanks very much. A question that's come from one of our colleagues, I think primarily addressed to Simone, though I think David could perhaps have some interesting insights on this, about the notion of deplatforming. Could that ultimately serve to amplify President Trump's voice or another populist voice by sort of adding to the sense of indignity that he or she has been, you know, has his or her voice taken away, and that he's really a victim of this liberal cabal? And then aren't alternative forms of social media sort of constantly appearing that would provide a voice, just as the alternative news outlets have emerged as Fox has diminished somewhat in President Trump's estimation?
Well, in the deplatforming, this goes back to something that Marty said. It's not just Twitter, right? It's the fact that it's the president on Twitter. And so I think you're going to see a huge difference when he's no longer the president. He's going to have a following. He's not on Twitter. He's going to be on something else. It's just not going to have the same power. And people will already, you know, complain about who is this guy, Jack Dorsey, that he gets to decide, you know, free speech. But the power of his voice, we will see in the next 6 months, will be cut in half. It's just, there's just no question about that, even with the narrative of. That's the first thing. The second, you know, my question is like who, why, and when you decide to deplatform, right? So what do you have to do? So what kind of power do you have to have? What kind of information it is? What kind of falsehood has to be? How do you make the assessment, and who makes the assessment that now this information is really having some terrible, you know, effect? And to leave that in the hands of one individual, who I think actually Jack Dorsey has pretty good judgment, and you know, what's his face at Facebook doesn't. But I mean, we shouldn't be relying on these people's personalities. So, I mean, the answer is that yes, there is going to be some pushback. There is going to be some, you know, talk about the left silencing. But in the bigger picture, this was false information that is undermining the democracy. And in the bigger picture, those two things, not being president and not being on Twitter, will have a huge impact on slowing down the misinformation coming out from him.
Can I just say one thing about that? Can I say one thing? I agree that going forward, Marty's probably right, and Simone's right too. There's going to be evolving platforms, and it's impossible to completely cut them off. But I think that when I said we're in a dangerous situation, I believe we are, and I believe it may be short term, but we are in effect in a state of exception right now, the United States. And that state of exception occurred when in Congress, when it was Mike Pence who organized the security response in any, and when the president of the United States decided not to do so. And in effect, at that point, if you're looking for your coup, right, at that point, at that moment, at that one moment, the chain of command was broken. That's a very important legal distinction. And until the swearing in of the next president of the United States, I think it would be fully justified, not political, not in the sense of a left-right distinction, to deplatform Donald Trump, so he could not again take us down that road. Right? That's the state of exception that we're in right now, and it's an exceptionally dangerous one. I don't say it lightly, but I think it's perfectly justifiable on public safety grounds. And that's where we are. So it's a small amendment. The long run, I think you guys are experts at this, and I'm not. But I think in the short run, I think there is no real replacement for Twitter. He has his army out there, and he has millions and millions of people waiting for each tweet. And I think that can be stopped.
So we have a.
I'd add something. I'm sorry. I think that the idea is predicated on strict fact checking that goes far beyond what mainstream media did in the early years of the Trump administration. I think anybody who runs for elective office has an obligation, a moral obligation, to try to tell the truth, to give the best sense of information that is accurate. And that's something that everybody is not going to live up to, but it's something that we have to, count on ourselves and mainstream media to keep promoting and keep challenging when people tell untruths or outright lies. And I think we in the Academy also have a special obligation to do that.
Thank you, David. We've had a number of questions about what guardrails are left in place to constrain President Trump in the remaining time he has in office. Marty, you've spoken to the issue and the unlikely possibilities of impeachment or the removal through the 25th Amendment, but we've had questions about what can constrain the president in the final days. And this is, of course, reminded by Speaker Pelosi's statement that she issued today, where Speaker Pelosi said this morning, I spoke to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, to discuss available precautions for preventing an unstable president from initiating military hostilities or accessing the launch codes and a nuclear strike, which, of course, were members of the chain of command to resist. We would be in our own way in violation of the chain of command, in our own dangerous waters of a military resisting the commander in chief. So, Marty, what are the ways that the cabinet, especially as members of the cabinet resign, what are the options to restrain the president?
Well, first of all, let's start at the beginning and say the president is the commander in chief of military forces in the United States. And, that's pretty clear. On the other hand, in military codes of conduct, there's the code of conduct is to not take a unethical order and to be able to just say, no, that is unethical. And so that's what the position would be in. And the generals or whatever would have to be in consultation with the defense secretary or the secretary of the Army, the Air Force, whatever would be relevant. And, we're put in a very touchy situation there legally of not obeying a presidential order. And what happened in the Nixon administration was basically Defense Secretary Schlesinger put out the word to all the Joint Chiefs that check with me before you do anything drastic. And that seemed fair enough in retrospect. And I would hope that they would do that again. Personally, let me say, I'm more worried about other actions that Trump might take, which have less consequences for the country. And, my reading of Trump, for what it's worth, and it's just my reading, is that he's more concerned about his own personal well-being and the well-being of his family. And I think, the remaining days will mostly be about planning pardons. And that's unfortunate, but it's, in the long run, not really dangerous. It's my view.
Well, we may have time for one final short question. Professor DeCipio, do you have one in mind?
I do. Each of you has a minute with President-elect Biden. What would you tell him, perhaps things that he already knows, to move the country forward after 4 years of President Trump and one of the worst weeks in American history. How do we rebuild from here? Professor Chambers.
Biden's rhetoric, I love it. It's let's all come together. I can work, both sides. I think the United States right now is in such a terrible, polarized, partisan position that, it's not going to be possible actually to do that. I'm really, really, really concerned with misinformation. And I think, for example, in the case, so there's this other study. It was a huge, huge study, 38 million news pieces across the globe about COVID and misinformation about COVID. And it turns out that across the globe, Trump was the major source of misinformation about COVID. And that misinformation is killing people. And so I'm really concerned. I don't think we're going to, bridge the partisan divide in any way soon, but maybe we can bridge a little bit of the information divide. And I think that will have to do with regulation of social media and the internet, and really thinking hard about how to do that and how to, and Fox News. Fox News also has been a really bad player in this game. So I would advise just look at information and communication and try to work in that area.
Thank you very much. Professor Meyer.
There's a lot of stuff to do, but the first thing that I would think of is focus on making people's lives better immediately. And the ways to do, there are two big fronts to struggle on. The first front is COVID, to get people who know stuff about vaccines, who know stuff about logistics, to get vaccines out as quickly and reliably as possible and deliver. Second, which maybe is even more important over the long run, is push economic and social policies that immediately improve people's lives. The $2,000 check is one thing. Aid to states to bail out the states for the double dip recession we just are slipping into right now is essential. If people's lives are fundamentally better, fewer of them will be accessible to crazy, disruptive, dangerous, anti-democratic movements. So Biden has to work on delivering.
Thank you very much. Professor Kopstein.
I agree with what my co-panelists have already said. I think, and just to group it a bit larger, I think that Biden has done a brilliant job at calming the discourse down since being elected, staying off social media, being very calm, not loud, not fast, but slow and expert. Now, what has to be fast, of course, and I think David's completely right, as they need to militarize the distribution of the vaccine. That if not actually military, they need to make it a #1 priority and to get it out as fast as possible. Once people are, what's hard to underestimate here is how disruptive all of this has been to everybody's lives and how angry it's made the entire society. I mean, moving halfway back to normal will take down the temperature a great deal. And then one other broad thing that wasn't mentioned, to rebuild the civil service. Trump has spent 4 years demolishing expertise within government bureaucracy. The State Department has been completely decimated. The CDC has lost credibility. I think that I could go on and on. Rebuilding the government bureaucracies has got to be a priority.
Thank you very much, Professor Kopstein. Professor Wattenberg, a fellow child of the Federal Civil Service.
Yes, a grandchild. My grandfather started civil service in 1917. I would focus on what at least was the impetus for the riot, which was the election and the election procedures and the criticism of various state procedures and how they were changed and the lack of uniformity in our elections And there was a bill that had unanimous support among Democrats, at least, in the House of Representatives, which is called For the People Act, introduced by Representative Sarbanes of Maryland. And it's already been reintroduced in the 117th Congress, which is the current Congress. It didn't get a vote in the Senate. It will this time. And I would ask President-elect Biden, soon to be President Biden, to say what I want the Democrats to do in the Senate is to say this cannot be filibustered. I want to carve out an exception for voting reform. If the Republicans do not want to support voting reform, let's work with them on the standardization of absentee ballots that I think they want, and maybe come up with a separate bill that could be passed almost unanimously. But in any case, you can't filibuster voting reform. Let's pass voting reform, make it a priority. Nancy Pelosi had it be called HR 1 in the previous Congress, which meant it was their top priority. And so they said it was their top priority. The evidence from this election shows that we need to do it, if you ask me. So I'd say, you know, he can use the bully pulpit of the presidency to get this done. So that was what I would focus on. Not the others are great ideas too, I would add. Thanks.
Okay, with that, we'll conclude our session. And thank you so much to our panelists for sharing their perspectives today, Louis for moderating, Claudia Nakua for helping to organize this with Andrew, and to all of you who joined us online and asked us our excellent questions and have begun this work of understanding and figuring out the next steps for a future where the events of Wednesday are less likely. Thank you so much. With that, we'll sign off.